I find no value in suffering whatsoever, and I find no value in an absence of pleasure whatsoever. I don't care if those said things made me grow as a person or as a composer. I would still find no value in those things, and I would find no value in such a way of life and in such a way of composing. I am completely fine the way I am, with the life of full pleasure that I once had before in the past before I became depressed and developed this anhedonia, which is an absence of pleasure, which is a negative symptom of schizophrenia. I don't need any suffering in my life. I don't need any absence of pleasure in my life. I don't need any of this. I realize that those things are inevitable sometimes and aren't choices sometimes, but I am just simply pointing out here that they have no value to me and only serve to make me and my life miserable and nothing more. Suffering and an absence of pleasure only serve to be a mockery and an insult to me, since they take away the one and only life I ever found value in and wanted to live, which would be a life with as much pleasure and as little suffering and absence of pleasure as possible. I can give an analogy for what my life and composing dream is like having this absence of pleasure. They say that life is like a battle. Some people find good value in these battles. They find value in their suffering and absence of pleasure and in striving and pushing forward through that suffering and absence of pleasure. But not me. I only find value in having my full normal pleasure in life and doing great things, becoming a great composer and striving and pushing forward in life through my feelings of pure pleasure alone and nothing else. You do not even have to compose dark, tragic, gothic compositions through having a bad life and in having suffering and absence of pleasure in your life. You can do so just as good and even better through the pleasure in dark, gothic, and tragic things instead. Many things that can be achieved through having suffering and absence of pleasure can be achieved just as good and even better through pure pleasure instead. For example, I have composed awesome, dark, gothic, and tragic themes in my mind when I had my full pleasure in the past. But now that I have lost my pleasure, I find no inspiration and am unable to create such pieces of music in my mind at all anymore, no matter how much I try. Even if I somehow could, they just simply wouldn't turn out as good due to the fact that there was no inspiration driving them. Now back to the battle analogy. It is like I am in a battlefield filled with nothing but loathsome pests chewing away at me and my life. These loathsome pests would be my anhedonia, depression, and or any other type of suffering for that matter. But the main pest of them all would be my anhedonia. I would just want to annihilate all of those loathsome pests in my life. Only once these pests have been cleared off the battlefield would this battlefield no longer be a battlefield. It would now be my own personal kingdom to rule and dominate in through my pleasure alone. This life to me was never meant to be a battlefield. It was meant to be a kingdom for good, innocent people who wish to do great things in their lives. Therefore, this is the reason why we need to find cures for suffering and an absence of pleasure. We also need to find a cure for mortality as well, so we can live eternal blissful lives. Some people would go bored or insane from living a life of pure bliss, but not me. This is because that is the only greatest life for me, and I would forever find immense value in living such a life without ever having gone bored or insane from living such a life. I could then compose all the types and genres of music I want through my pleasure alone. Both my immense value towards such an eternal blissful life and my immense hatred towards this life of suffering and mortality would allow me to live eternally in a blissful life without ever going bored or insane from it. I wouldn't be able to even go bored or insane from it in the first place, since being bored and going insane are a form of suffering. If all suffering is then eliminated through cures, then I could never go bored or insane in the first place. I am going to continue on here with one last thing. All the greatest artists and composers who have suffered and have had an absence of pleasure, either due to depression and or anhedonia, these artists and composers were nothing great. I am not insulting them when saying this. it is a compliment to them. Feelings of pleasure and suffering are the only things that define you in your lives as being either good, pleasure, or bad, suffering. Therefore, for me to go up to these great composers and tell them that they were great for their suffering when they weren't, then that would be the mockery and insult to them. They might very well be offended if I were to tell them that only them having their full feelings of pleasure would make their greatness something truly great. But I am only giving them a compliment regardless of how offended they feel from it. They might have been great just in terms of the fact that they possess great skills and talents, but that said greatness is bland, dead, lifeless, and zombie-like without our feelings of pleasure to breathe transcending life into that greatness and make it something truly great. Even if you are an artist who possesses terrible skills and talents, then as long as you have your full feelings of pleasure in your life, then that is the only thing that would define you as a great artist, a great person, and a great life.